Where do you even get started planning a vegetable garden? G'day there, I'm Dana from Pewakaika Valley Homestead, and today I'm going to take some time to talk to you about how I go about planning my garden for the year and how as a beginner gardener you can plan your garden as well. Starting a garden from scratch can be quite overwhelming, and I have put together a simple instructional video on how you can grow your very first garden, and I'll put a link to it up the top there so that you can watch it. Once you've got your head around starting a garden, you might want to actually start planning out and making plans for a bigger garden with multiple garden beds and growing multiple different crops. And as soon as that starts happening, it can be quite overwhelming to know what to plant when and where to plant things and how to plan for succession gardening as well. Something you'll need to know when you very first start planning your garden is when your first frost date is, when your last frost date is, which direction your sun goes in, where your predominant wind is, and also what the weather's like, how wet your soil is, how wet and boggy the ground is, how quickly it warms up, how dry it gets. Usually a quick Google search will tell you about your frost dates, and usually your planting will go around your frost dates, particularly with frost tender plants, things that the frost will kill off. Usually we don't plant out any frost tender things until a good week after what's considered our last frost date. So this is the date that, generally speaking, that's the last day that you could possibly get a frost. Often they end before then. Ideally, a vegetable garden will be somewhere that faces the sun, is protected from the wind, and is raised up off any boggy or clayey soil. If those things are put in place right from the beginning, it will make your gardening season so much easier. So if your ground is particularly wet, if it is particularly hard, if it is particularly clayey or particularly stony, I really recommend you look at putting in some raised beds. Your raised beds might have wooden sides, they might have tin sides, or they might literally just be built on top of the soil so that they are sort of a good 4 to 6 inches tall. You can just do them with raised sides in the same way that market gardens do their raised beds. A raised bed will warm up faster, it will drain better, and it allows you to add more nutrients and more compost. And generally speaking, plants will grow better in a raised bed than they do straight in the ground. The next thing you need to do is choose what varieties you want to grow. Often families will have sort of bulk standards that they eat a lot of, and they're the plants that I really recommend you focus on to start with. For us, that's potatoes, carrots, beans, peas, and salad greens and brassicas. In the tunnel house, that's where we also do tomatoes and peppers. We don't really focus on growing much else because these are the things that we know we eat a lot of. Putting together a planting plan can be really overwhelming, and I recommend you look into buying your seeds first, because on the backs of those packets are how long they are to germinate, how long until harvest, and then usually I add an extra week or two onto that as well, because if you're growing in the cooler ends of the season, they will take longer than what the packet says. The timing on the packet is basically for the prime time for growing, which is smack bang in the middle of the warm time where they're getting plenty of warmth, plenty of water. And then you can use those as a starting place for planning out what you're going to be putting in which parts of your garden and when. Next step, I recommend you taking inventory of what gardens you have. Draw them out or write them down, how big they are and how many of them you have, and then number them, which will make it easier for keeping track of what you're putting in what garden. Once you have a bit of a plan of what you want to go where in the garden, you can also write on that plan how long those plants will actually be taking up that garden space, and you'll probably find that a lot of them don't take up the garden space for the entire growing season. So that's when subsequent planting, rotational planting, and successional planting all come into play. I have a spreadsheet that I can give you that's interactive that will add all those sorts of things in for you, so I'll put a link to that down below. Fill your garden plan up with all the things that you know you definitely want to eat, and then you can go back through again later and add in all the extras. I add in radishes and salad greens in the gaps because they have a much faster turnover. They're ready much quicker. They can work as a filler or as a catch crop at the end of the year, just as like a bonus crop before the final frost hits. And then once I've got a plan of what I want and where I want them, and then I can count backwards 4 to 8 weeks before they're meant to go in the ground, I can work out when I need to sow them in transplant trays so that they're ready to put out into the garden when I need them. Now personally, I think the best way of getting started gardening is really just to make a garden bed and plant stuff in it. And I think if you've never gardened before, get yourself some seedlings from the hardware store or from the local nursery and get some seedlings in and just grow. And I think for a first experience, that's probably the best way to go about it. If, however, you want to be getting the most amount of food out of the garden that you can possibly grow, then having a bit of a succession plan is really what you need to be doing. Some people try and do like a whole year's plan all at once, and they'll be like, well, you know, we're going to, in this garden bed, we're going to grow this, and then we're going to grow this, and then we're going to grow this, and just do it over a whole year. What I prefer to do is to do it month by month. I have a book. It's not a very exciting book. It is just a workbook from, you know, like what the kids use at school. And in it, I have simply started with a plan of what garden beds I have, and I have numbered them, and then I've written the numbers down the side, and then next to that I've got a first crop and a second crop. I'm not going to be getting fancy with trying to do 3 or 4 rotations in a garden bed. Realistically, with how long our growing season is, 2 crops in a garden bed is pretty much all we're going to get out of it. And I think honestly it's probably quite a good amount for people to be aiming for in general. And then once I've got it written down as to what I'm going to be putting in which garden bed, then I start trying to work out when the garden beds are going to have those crops in them. And from there you're able to kind of plan backwards about when you're going to actually get those plants sown, either in cell trays or whether you're going to buy transplants from the store, whichever way you want to go. Usually start sowing your seeds for your seedlings between 4 and 8 weeks before you want to put them out in the garden. Personally, I never have great success with seedlings, especially early in the season, with them getting out by 4 weeks. So early in the season, I will usually start them 8 weeks before I want them in the garden. So for us, if we can put stuff out in the middle of September, which for us is the first month of spring, I'll usually be starting my seeds in like mid-July to the end of July so that they're ready to plant out in September. And they'll tend to be my sort of more frost-hardy items that don't mind too much that we might be hit by a later frost. So once I have a rough list of what I want to plant and roughly how long they're going to be in the ground for. So some things will be in the ground for 3 months. Some things will be in the ground for 6 months. Some things will be in the ground for just a couple of months, maybe even just a month or so, depending on what they are. If you're not sure how long plants are going to be in the ground for and how long till harvest, checking the back of the packets is usually a really good way of knowing. Different varieties will take different amounts of time, and personally things take forever to grow here. It is a little bit colder than a lot of places, so I always add an extra couple of weeks on top of whatever the seed packet suggests that however long harvest time is going to take. So once I have myself my list, I don't know if you can see them there, it's very messy, but I write by hand and that's just how I go. I find it easier to do it on here than on the computer because I can take this outside with me, especially in the big plant up months. I can take it out with me with a big list of what I need to put and where I need to put them. So it is a pretty well loved book. The covers come off it. It's a bit of a mess, but it's how I keep track of what I've planted and where I've planted them. And then what I do after that is just go through each month. So here I've got April, and I've just written what I'm planting for that month, really. I'm not sure why I've started in April. Yes, I am. I am sure why I started in April, because these are the things I can sow before winter. We are in the southern hemisphere, so we're in the prime of our growing season at the moment. but I understand that a lot of our American counterparts are just heading into the end of winter where they are and starting to think about getting some things in the ground. So things that we can get in the ground here even before the frosts end, we put in what we call broad beans. They're also known as fava beans. I usually get my garlic in before winter hits, but if I haven't got it in before winter, then early spring is the other good time to get it in. And so all I do is I go through each month. So this is my June, which for us is midwinter. This is my tomato planting list. So I've got the different varieties of tomatoes I'm growing, whether they're determined or indeterminate, how many days they're expected until they start producing, and whether they're cooking or slicing or cherry tomatoes or whatever. And then beside that, I've written the date that I have planted them. I'm being eaten by sandflies. What I usually do is go through the book and write down on the months what I need to be planting those months, and what I need to be harvesting those months. So for example, my early potatoes I put in early springtime, and I count forward 12 weeks, and that's usually when your early potatoes are ready to harvest. So once they're out, I can choose either to put in a second lot of potatoes or put in some kale or whatever I want to do. So the first pass through, I just go through and put in when I want to plant stuff and when I want to harvest things, like when they're going to be ready to harvest. And I focused first of all on the main things that I definitely want to grow. So for us, that's peas, beans, carrots. We eat so many carrots, potatoes and tomatoes, capsicums, and then some of the brassicas like cabbage, cauliflower, what else do we go? Cabbage, cauliflower, kale, and then I will go through if there's spare gaps that I can tell in the different garden beds. So I might do one bed of kale but only half a bed of cauliflower. So that other half bed I will either sow in bonus carrots, because we do eat so many of them, or I might choose to put the salad greens in there. But salad greens, lettuce, those sorts of things, they have a much faster turnover, so they're quite good to sneak in the gaps. My skirt has just fallen in the water. I think my boys have been playing here. I couldn't work out why I was suddenly getting really cold. My skirt was absorbing all the water and getting me all wet. So these are sort of my busier months. These are my early spring months for us, and so I write down the things that I want to sow, the things that I need to transplant that I've already sown, and as I go through I can also write what I have harvested, and I can add notes of whether it was a good harvest, whether it was a rubbish harvest, whether I'll grow this plant again, and all of these things, and of course all the dates, and all of these things I use to inform my list for next year. The upside to doing my planting list month to month is it's less overwhelming, and I can tell what I need to plant for the month without stressing about trying to go through and go, oh, I need to plant this, and it's a lot less overwhelming. If I know that on October I need to plant my leeks, my parsnip, my silver beet, my turnips, potatoes, like I can just go through my list, and then at the time I can say also I'm harvesting the last of the winter greens out of the tunnel house and pulling those out, and I've also written down here that I need to graft my apple trees. And down the bottom I've then added like the onions needed transplanted, the lettuces need direct sown, all those sorts of things. So it's a really good way of just keeping track of what you need done without being overwhelmed with a big planting list, which I've done in the past, which is a little bit more like this, which can get quite confusing. Each of these rows is a garden bed, and it's got different varieties, how long they're going to be in for, and then what type they are that are going in after them, and trying to work out when I'm meant to have sown that kale beforehand to get it in there. I find this a lot more of a confusing way of planning out the garden, which is why I've swapped to doing it the way I have. Some things I will say about planning your garden for the first time: 1, grow food you're going to eat. 2, don't get overwhelmed. Don't try and start everything from seed right from the beginning. Get yourself some transplants, make it easy on yourself. Don't stress if you miss a planting window. The worst that can happen is the plants don't flourish. So put them in anyway, you never know what's going to happen. Don't be afraid to ask other people if you need help with what works well in your area, when to plant stuff. Join some local, Facebook groups or MeWe groups or whatever. A lot of local areas do have gardening groups on there. You can say, what are the best varieties of carrots to grow? What time of year do you put these things in? Learn that local knowledge is really, really the best thing that you can find for yourself. And the very best thing you can find for yourself is keeping your own super local knowledge by keeping yourself a decent plant diary. Knowing how many plants to grow can be really difficult. I have a PDF that I can give you on how many plants per person if you're trying to grow your entire family's worth of food, so I'll put a link to that down below as well, and that can be a really good starting place. Knowing you can just go through and pull out the varieties that you know you will eat and the ones that you do want to grow, and then it will give you a starting place of how many plants to actually get in the ground. One of the other things that can be really hard to know when it comes to starting a garden for the first time is how far apart to put the plants, how much spacing to allow, how many plants you can fit in an area. And the square foot gardening method I find quite helpful in this regard. It will give you a good feel for how many plants per square foot that you can fit in. Generally speaking, if I'm talking about plants that will grow to plant size, I guess, for lack of any other, so mostly brassicas, lettuces, those sorts of things. It's also how far apart I put my tomatoes. I put them all about a foot apart. If in doubt, put them a foot apart. And my courgettes I do 2 feet. My squashes I do 2 or 3 feet. Peas, beans, carrots, any of those smaller, skinnier plants, I usually put about a hand width apart. And that's usually a good sort of guide for those sorts of things. I hope you found this video really useful. If you have, hit the like button, and I will see you in the next one.